helps determine how we shape the discussion on abortion. For example, many people consider rape to justify abortion. It's an awful, awful thing to be having to deal with, and I would never even consider myself understanding what that's about. But if we consider the fact that we wouldn't kill a person conceived through rape just because they were conceived through rape, if they were already born, then maybe we should also be able to say, well, if it's a person or if it's a human being who has value in the womb, even if she was conceived through rape, we wouldn't kill her either, right? Or what about issues of poverty or health problems? Right, all of those issues, we don't kill born people for those same reasons, do we? So if what's inside the womb is another human being like us, then obviously those reasons, as hard as they are, don't justify killing them. In the same way, things like unwantedness, the age of the woman or the fetus, the fact that there's no support or a lack of help for career, all of those reasons wouldn't justify taking the life of a born person, and so they shouldn't justify taking the life of an unborn person if they're persons. So it's important then to be able to understand this is the situation that we're in. If we want to be able to answer the ethicalness of abortion, we need to be able to answer the question, what is it that we're actually taking? What life are we taking? As I mentioned, many people in the abortion debate want to be able to say it doesn't matter because whatever is not born yet, it should have no rights. Joyce Arthur, a famous abortion advocate here in Calgary, says this, "Now a flake of dandruff from my head is human, but it is not a human being. And in this sense, neither is this fertilized egg. Anti-choicers will respond that a fertilized egg is not like dandruff, but because the egg consists of a unique set of chromosomes that makes it a distinct human being. But with cloning, a cell from my dandruff is enough to create a new human being. Although it would have my identical makeup, it would still be a unique individual because human beings are much more than our genes." So here she's arguing that the fetus, the zygote, the embryo, is just like a dandruff. That does not sound like a very appealing or attractive description, does it? And unfortunately, many pro-choice advocates I argue with talk this kind of way. They would rather not even discuss or talk about the fetus, the embryo, the preborn in any kind of way. They want to dismiss it or dismiss them as simply something that we don't even have to think about. Now, one of the reasons why I respect Dr. Nye is he doesn't agree with that position. He actually disagrees that this view is even morally or ethically defensible. I mean, that's fair to say. I'll let you speak for yourself later on. But he disagrees. Because not only is it ethically problematic, it's actually even so different than what our our law says, that it's actually such an extreme position. No other democratic state in the world has a position that lets abortion be permitted throughout all 9 months of pregnancy for any reason or for no reason at all. In fact, the only woman who sat at the Supreme Court when the Morgenthaler decision came down that legalized abortion, that struck down the abortion law, Justice Bertha Wilson, she actually says, the precise point in development of the fetus in which the state's interest in its protection becomes compelling should be left to the informed judgment of the legislature, which is in a position to receive submissions on the subject from all relevant disciplines. Even the Supreme Court said the legislature has a right to make a law about abortion and has that duty to do so, in fact. And this was one of the most pro-choice judges on the Supreme Court that legalized abortion. It's a position, I think, is far more legally defensible than what Joyce Arthur's position is. As I said, though, this is not the position of Dr. Nye, which, again, I really appreciate. It's closer to what the judge is saying. When we debated last time, he said, if an early fetus survives, it will simply be a body that can support a mental individual. It will not be this individual experience the goods she experiences. In his position, and I'll let him speak more to it, he says that around about 20 weeks or so, about 5 months, a fetus is able to develop a mind, fetal mind is the word he uses, develops between 20 and 28 weeks. Neural requirement for mental life in humans, activity, the cerebellum, cortex, and the thalamus, imagining, introspection, and other kinds of behavior, all of those things are developing in the part of the brain that we are able to detect around this time. And so he says at this point then, this is the individual when we can say we're actually a new, or an organism, a human being. This is what we should value. But I think the problem with this kind of argument is that he's arguing that the fetus is something different from us. It's a separate organism from us. Therefore, according to this view, elective abortion is morally permissible before 20 weeks because it's different. The argument here is that the activity of the brain at this point now makes it detectable now as something that we are, like human beings. We have this ability. Therefore, this is what makes us valuable. Anything before that is simply a shell of what we are. It's something that will get a mind, but it is not a mind in itself. And therefore, because we value human minds, we're rational beings, the organism prior to getting this mind is not as equally valuable. Therefore, elective abortion should be seen as moral. But I want to point out as well, I think he mentioned this last time, that he alluded to Avatar as part of the reason why he can argue this point. Right? Avatar was a movie where a person's mind was inserted into a big giant blue organism. That giant organism then became him. And so the parallel, I think, is quite obvious if you haven't seen the movie. The problem is, I think, when you look at the fetus, there's 6 problematic arguments or points that I'd like to make that I think show that his position doesn't defeat my first premise, which is that human beings have human rights. There's 6 arguments I want to make in my opening comments just to show that this idea, I think, is still problematic. First, his position is not biologically sound. We do not classify organisms based solely on their current capacity. Here's a quick picture from a biology text that talks about different kinds of domains and kingdoms. Notice animals are listed as multicellular and take in their food. Now, what's important is when you look at an organism, you don't look at the current state of the organism and say that you classify it based on its current state. What you do is you look at the kind of organism it is and classify it based on that. So, for example, if we had a fetus or an embryo of a woolly mammoth, would we say that woolly mammoths were extinct if this fetus or embryo were still alive? Or would we classify it solely on its current abilities? Wouldn't we classify it based on the kind of organism it is? In fact, that's why we would say there's a difference between current capacity and inherent capacity. The thing that we are matters, not just what we can do right now. Because the thing that we are is what we are regardless of the situation we're in. Our brains, our minds may not work all the time. Some of us, when we're studying here at the university, I remember my mind was working all the time, even when I was sleeping, trying to think of ways to answer questions. Sometimes completely wasted and not thinking at all. But my individual identity did not change just because my capacities changed. And we see this too when we look at the kinds of things that humans are. And by the way, the things that humans are not parts of things. So we are not sperm or egg. In fact, any biological organism that reproduces sexually begins life at fertilization when these two things fuse, not after. So we were never a sperm, we were never an egg. We existed when those two things came together. That's not any kind of biblical approach, that's just biology. Second point, the fetus is different from us in terms of development, not in kind. In terms of development, not in kind. Here's a quick video that shows the development of what an embryo looks like, a human embryo looks like. And I want you to think about this. Where in this development does a brain get inserted? about the first and second trimester. If you think about it, where in the process of development was a brain inserted? Are we talking about something that's different from us? When we say fetus or embryo, are we simply talking about stages of development by people like us? See the difference? We're not talking about separate beings, we're talking about stages of development. And when we talk about those stages, Dr. Maureen Kondik, an assistant professor of neurobiology, says embryos are genetically unique human organisms fully possessing the integrated biological function that defines human life at all stages of development, continuing throughout adulthood until death. In other words, we're not just computers where someone inserts software. We're much more than that. In fact, it's like a computer that plans itself. And if that's the case, even if we think of it that way, that must make a unique kind of organism that's able to do that. And by the way, Joyce Arthur is wrong. When we talk about our own individual cells, like our hand cells, and they say, oh, we can create human beings from that. No, you can't. The process to create a dolly of a sheep, the first cloned mammal, actually involved fertilization, where they took an egg from one animal, removed the nucleus of it, inserted DNA into it, zapped it with electricity, and created an embryo. In other words, the process of fertilization had to happen in order for that process to be created. Quickly, I want to go through these other points. I'll talk a little bit more about it. Thirdly, it is not what we practice ethically now. We do not value fetuses in human beings when it comes to other organisms differently from what other members of their species are. We don't value people based on their abilities. And this is where Dr. Nye and I completely agree. I support what he does when he speaks about people like Marilyn Rivera's daughter, Emily, who was born at 23 weeks, was not able to see or survive. Her survival rate was like 3%, but was still treated like a human being at that stage. When we talk about people with disabilities or developmental disabilities, we don't value them based simply on what they can do now. And when we talk about animal rights, right, when we talk about valuing animal rights that have a certain kind of rational mind, like chimpanzees, we don't see them valuable only as individuals. We would say that they're valuable even if they're at a fetal stage. In fact, if we were to discover an alien species and only discover one member of that species, a fetus version of it, a fetal version of it, or embryonic version of it, scientists would not say, oh, it's just a cockroach or something like that. They would recognize the kind of species it is and say, we have discovered intelligent life. Fourth point, mind's rationality is not transferable. We talk about people who are like Sergio Canavoro, who actually speaks to the idea that we can transfer brains and transfer minds. And he promised last year that this is going to happen. That's why it didn't. Because it's not science. It's science fiction. In fact, here's a quick clip I'll play talking about from an actual specialist about whether this is actually feasible.
Seems like there are amazing medical advancements being reported almost every single week these days, but this next one has an entire medical community questioning its shocking claims.
The medical advances over the years have been awe-inspiring, to say the least. Doctors can now transplant everything from livers and lungs to faces and hands. They can even transform your toe into a thumb. But now, a neurosurgeon in Italy is claiming that he will be able to successfully complete the first ever head transplant. A 30-year-old man with muscular atrophy has reportedly volunteered to have his head transplanted onto a healthy donor body in 2017. Experts in the U.S. are skeptical of the procedure, and this miracle surgery has people wondering, is it real or science fiction?
And joining us to discuss this head scratcher is skull-based surgeon and founder of the Skull-Based Institute, Dr. Harsh Shahini. Welcome back, sir.
Thank you.
All right, let's cut to the chase. Say it ain't so.
Well, it ain't so. First of all, it's a fascinating topic. I'm all for innovation, as you know, and technology. We currently do face transplants, and we know how to connect the vessels and stuff. In the case of the brain, we do know how to decrease the metabolism of the brain by either cooling it or pentobarb coma, induced coma. The first time I introduced an endoscope into the brain, I did it on pigs, and before I ever did it on a human. So you have to show success in animals. The Chinese surgeon has done a few rats. None of them survived 1 hour. This is in rats.
Well, and my problem with this story is that it brings a false sense of hope to individuals because they read the headlines and they think, oh, wow, this is great. Sounds like just in a few years, no problem, we'll just do a head transplant. You know, we're just not there.
So when we listen to Dr. Nye today and ask him the question that I've asked you, I think we should ask him as well. What is it that we're actually killing? What is that organism that we're actually ending? Is it something that is a different organism, or is it something that's just simply humans at a different stage of development? Thank you.
Now Dr. Nye will give his reply. You will have 20 minutes.
Okay. Well, put it to get it set up. I do the BGA, right? Yep. Right. Well, thank you so much, Daniel. Thank you so much, Deirdre, and thank you so much, Jojo. I really appreciate what you, the Undergrad Philosophical Association, and the U Alberta Pro-Life have done here with putting on this event. I can't really emphasize how important it is in this day and age of political tribalism and sort of just the perpetuation of echo chambers where people hear the same things and don't hear reasoned arguments from the outside. To have an event like this where those of us with very different perspectives come together and have a reasoned discussion. So as Jojo actually indicated, I am only going to be defending elective early term abortion. And what I roughly mean by early term abortion is abortion performed prior to 20 weeks developmental age or post-fertilization, which really is the vast majority of abortions. Getting exact numbers in Canada is a little bit hard, but I think it's fair to say that it's, by any numbers, it's the vast majority. So of hospital abortions where they reported the actual gestational age, 83% had been performed by 12 weeks, and 92% had been performed by 16 weeks. Again, so because abortion clinics don't report the actual numbers, the actual gestational age, it's difficult to get a sense of what's going on totally in Canada. But it's been estimated that maybe of the total abortions in Canada, something like 90.6% are performed by 12 weeks, and actually 99.4% are performed by 20 weeks. So only about 0.6% of abortions are performed over 20 weeks. So I think that because of this, although I'm only defending elective early-term abortion, that's the vast majority of elective abortions, right? So I think that I can count as actually opposing Jojo, right? And defending this view that elective abortion is by and large the way it's practiced morally permissible. So again, by elective we mean not for serious medical reasons, although there are some controversies about exactly what that amounts to. Obviously, just because it's elective doesn't mean it's done for completely trivial reasons. Continuing with a pregnancy as opposed to having elective abortion involves, of course, the usual risks and costs of pregnancy, and typically it's done because of the things Jojo mentioned, difficulty parenting, or difficulty, for socioeconomic reasons, and not wanting to continue with pregnancy and have the child and adopt the child out. Now, of course, that doesn't settle that it's permissible because, as Jojo pointed out, that would by no means justify infanticide or anything like that. Certainly I think, certainly he thinks, and I'm very prepared to argue against those who, and I do in my own work, argue against those who think that infanticide is actually morally permissible. You might wonder, though, does this, so is it even possible to get an elective late-term abortion in Canada? So does our discussion have any implications for late-term abortion at all? Well, it depends on how late you mean and what exactly you mean by serious medical reasons. So in places like Ontario and Quebec, some places, my understanding is, you can get abortions up to 23 or 24 weeks gestational age. Actually, so a lot of abortions that are counted as therapeutic or non-medical are actually cases, and very late ones, are actually cases of abortions of fetuses with disabilities, and I do think that this is controversial. And in fact, Keanu Owen and I, Keanu Owen in the Faculty of Nursing and I are planning an event for September on issues about the euthanasia and selective non-treatment of disabled neonates. So keep that in mind if you're interested. where I will air the moral concerns I have about this practice and make arguments for those being concerns. And I think that in fact a lot of the issues with very late term abortion of fetuses with disabilities, are very similar to those worries about selective non-treatment euthanasia of fetuses with disabilities. Okay, so now I very much agree with Jojo that the really crucial issue in abortion should be what it does to fetuses. And for convenience, I'm just going to speak of fetuses. I tend my remarks to cover early zygotes and embryos. I'll just say fetuses, right? So I actually agree with a lot of what he said about why this is the crucial issue. If you're interested on the slides, so I didn't go with the paper handout. I went with slides. They've been posted online and stuff. I understand.
We'll get them onto the event.
You'll get them onto the event. Okay. So if you're interested, and we can also talk about this in the Q&A. There are some arguments by philosophers like Judith Jarvis Thompson that know the really crucial thing is just bodily autonomy, and even if death harms fetuses in the same way it harms us, it's perfectly morally permissible, or at least in many circumstances. And I've got some reasons to doubt that on my slides. And again, we can talk about that in the Q&A. Okay, so I do then think that the crucial question with the ethics of abortion is whether there are the same sorts of objections to killing fetuses as to killing us. Just a slight reconstruction, if I take it Jojo's core argument, which I think initially, at the outset of inquiry does seem quite compelling. Sort of two premises here, right? It's seriously wrong to kill human beings, and early-term fetuses are human beings. I actually definitely agree that at least most early-term fetuses are human and they're organisms, right? So early-term fetuses are undeniably living. They're biologically alive, right? They're doing the metabolism thing and all that. And they're human, right? They're of the human species. They have the right phylogenetic descent and genetic makeup. Right, so they're living. They do metabolism, self-regulation, reproduction. Well, not yet the reproduction, but they have the genetic potential. They're human, right? They have the right genetic and phylogenetic history. And they're distinct organisms at the very least after 14 days, right? And like obviously most abortions, at least the clinic and the hospital ones are after, except for morning after pill stuff, they're after 14 days. So I don't want to sort of pick a big fight about this. There's some dispute, because they're you don't have cell differentiation before 14 days, so is it really a distinct organism? I mean, I don't care, right? So sorry. I don't think, again, the ones well past 14 days, 8 weeks and stuff, clearly organisms, right? No dispute there. So they had their own reproductive unit, they've got integrated function and all of that. So living, human, and organism, these are biological classificatory concepts. So we should defer to the biologists for how to use these. And again, I think clearly early-term fetuses are going to come out as living human organisms on those classifications. But the thing is, being is not, strictly speaking, to the extent that it's figuring in plausible ethical reasoning, just a biological concept. It's kind of an ethical concept. So you're free to call early-term fetuses human organisms, that's fine. But it's actually a kind of an ethical position to, so you can call early-term fetuses human organisms all you want, right? That's fine. But it's actually kind of an ethical position to say that they're human beings. So beings, I take it, insofar as this is figuring into plausible ethical reasoning, are entities that can be harmed and benefited in a literal, morally important sense. And by harms and benefits, I'm talking about things like, harms, suffering, being deprived of good things like good experiences, and being able to go and do exciting, engaging things. So that's the sort of thing that ethically important harm is that goes with being a being. It is true that we talk about, we sometimes metaphorically talk about, sort of harm and benefit in this other way. We say like high octane fuel is good for the car, but that's not, and so it's bad for the car, right, to not fill it with high octane fuel. But that's not really harm and benefit in the same sense that figures into plausible ethical principles against harming, where there's strong moral reasons against harming. That's just a different kind of talk. So whether an entity is a being in this sense is really not just a matter of whether it's a human life or a human organism. So, for example, in some ways, you might have hinted at this, it's just as wrong to kill aliens with the same psychology as typical human adults as it would be to kill human adults. So aliens as like Superman, right? Or the sort of aliens portrayed in things like Star Trek, right, where they're psychologically just like us, right? So clearly it's just as wrong to kill them as it is to kill us. So the ethics of killing doesn't really have anything fundamentally to do with what kinds of organisms and what biological classifications they fall under. So I think clearly the explanation for why it's just as wrong to kill psychologically identical aliens as us is that death would harm them just as much as us, right? It would deprive them of a future like ours with all those benefits. So all species membership really amounts to is just sort of the history of phylogenetic descent and sort of the way your molecules look. And I think that it's this arbitrarily, as sort of morally unimportant and arbitrary in itself as something like ethnicity, right? Let's just sort of clarify why what really should be at issue here. It should be whether we're harming these entities in a literal morally important sense rather than just what biological classification they should have. Let me return to the issue about skin cells. So it clearly seems permissible to kill human skin cells, as Jojo noted. Now, is it just because they aren't distinct organisms? I mean, if you turn to Arthur very charitably, I think this is the sort of thing she was trying to get at. I mean, the fact that they don't do their own metabolism and reproduction independent of what kinds of futures they might have and whether they would miss out on goods like enjoyment and achievement and exciting things, that really doesn't, it's just what biological classification they have independent of that thing of how much death is going to harm you. That doesn't seem like the right explanation why it's wrong to kill human skin cells. It seems like the right explanation is they're not going, even if we don't kill them, it's not like they're going to go on and enjoy all these morally important benefits. They're just going to sit there as skin cells, right? Not having any goods in their lives. And to also reinforce this, consider cases of embryos or fetuses that clearly won't experience future goods no matter what you do. Now I'm going to argue that all the early fetuses don't experience future goods. They're not the things that will experience future goods. But for right now, whatever we think about that, let's consider the cases where they clearly won't. So for example, if the only way to save a 4-year-old child from dying is by driving over in the road and killing 5 frozen embryos that are about to die anyway, surely that's fine, right, to run over the embryos. They're going to die anyway, right? There's no future goods for them. Similarly, very real case, ectopic pregnancy, right? This case of therapeutic abortion. So it's a case where an embryo attaches outside the uterus and the embryo is going to kill the mother and itself if left untreated. Clearly in that case, I think even those who have the greatest worries about pregnancy, like abortion, like Jojo, would concede, yeah, that's totally fine because the embryo is going to die anyway, right? So there's not really a problem. Okay, so it seems then that the serious objection to killing is that death harms the victim by depriving her of all future goods. And for us, I mean, that's the biggest harm you can have, right? I mean, depriving you of an entire lifetime full of goods, that's an enormous harm. And I think that that's what successfully explains why killing is such an enormous wrong. Right? Okay, so now, of course, this does leave open what a perfectly good pro-life or sort of argument that elective early term abortion is wrong in the non-ectopic cases, which is, I think, the best argument, what I consider the strongest. If I was going to be convinced otherwise, this is the sort of argument that would convince me, which is that of Don Marcus. So Marcus's argument that abortion is wrong is the following. So we human experiencers of goods are human organisms, which first existed as early fetuses, right? So if an early fetus survives in a non-ectopic pregnancy case, right, she will be identical to an older child and adult and experience the goods the older child and adult experience. So killing an early fetus deprives her of the goods of a future like ours. Next premise, what makes killing an entity, what I've just argued for, what makes killing an entity seriously wrong is it's harming her by depriving her of future goods. So conclusion, killing an early fetus, like killing us or an older child, is seriously wrong. Right? So I think that's a great argument. I just think that premise 1 and conclusion 1 and conclusion 2 are all false. And Jojo sort of intimated why I think that, so let me just explain that to you a bit. So I think it doesn't seem that we're just organisms or bodies. I think that we're mental individuals. So to motivate this, consider the brain transplant thought experiment. And it is a thought experiment. It doesn't really matter whether or not this is currently feasible with present technology, although it's bloody close, right? I actually, I have serious doubts about exactly how useful those butcheries that they did on the non-human animals were for this sort of thing. But in fact, you can see there were in fact cases where someone survived for a bit, and that happened. But again, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter how far in the future it is, as long as we can clearly imagine this case. That's all that really matters. When John Locke did this sort of thing, back in the 17th century, he didn't even sort of fill in hardware. He just sort of had a miraculous process whereby brains switched bodies. So I could have done that. But I just want to make, I'm following Derek Park, but I'm trying to make this vivid. So suppose sometime in the future, right, you and your twin are in an accident that destroys your body and your twin's brain. The individual who wakes up in your twin's body has all the same mental states as you, and of course has the same center of consciousness as you and everything. I think it's very clear that in this sort of case, you but not your twin would survive. If someone told you this was about to happen, you but not twin should expect to experience the good experiences of the individual who wakes up in twin's body. And we should all be glad for your sake, not twin's sake, that your brain wasn't left to die. So it seems, in this case, you survive, but your organism doesn't. Your twin's dead, but his organism survives, so you and your twin can't be your organisms. Similarly, consider the case that Jojo mentioned last time of diencephaly. So cases where, diencephaly, of twins conjoined below the neck. Abigail and Brittany Hensel, very real women, they share one body that functions harmoniously, but they're clearly two distinct beings. Each has an independent center of consciousness, and the death of one of them is not just like someone losing half her brain. That would be a very serious moral loss. So as beings or subjects of interest, I think it's quite clear, given these considerations, that we should be that we should see ourselves as mental individuals or human minds, not human organisms. So you survive transplant because your mind does. Abby and Brittany are distinct because they're distinct minds. Now, when do fetal minds begin? Well, they develop, as Jojo had actually mentioned, they develop somewhere between 20 and 28 weeks, and it is a gradual process. The neural requirements for mental life in humans, again, is complex orchestrated thalamocortical activity, and this has been established by imaging our experiences versus when we're in ischemia and coma, considerations of the plausible essential functional roles of subjective experience, richness, unity, domain generality, and all those sorts of things. So, the first connections in the thalamocortical system begin at 18 to 20 weeks developmental age. First sporadic activity can be detected in there at 20 to 21 weeks developmental age, and the first evoked potentials or stimulus to activity patterns can be seen at 20 to 25 weeks, 23 to 25 weeks developmental age, and by 25 to 28 weeks developmental age, you've got complex activity, sleep-wake cycles, arousal, and stress responses to pain and preemies. And even there's one, that's sort of the vast consensus among like all neuroscientists, except Pajor Merker has kind of gone off on his own and sort of argued that this midbrain basal ganglia or diencephalic system is sufficient for experience. But even if that thing is, its connections aren't really in place until 20 weeks developmental age anyway. So I think 20 weeks developmental age is a pretty safe lower bound for when you might have subjective experience. Okay, so then here's my argument that elective or early term abortion is permissible. So we, human experiences of goods, are human minds who first existed at 20 to 28 weeks developmental age. If an early fetus survives, it will simply be a body that can support a mental individual. It will not be that individual or experience the good she experiences. Again, the analogy would be to the avatar bodies, right, that someone could inhabit but no one's inhabiting yet. And so killing an early fetus doesn't deprive it of goods. Like abstaining from sex, it just prevents someone who would have experienced goods from coming into existence. And then again, as Marquis said, what makes killing an entity seriously wrong is it's harming her by depriving her of future goods. So killing an early fetus, like abstaining from sex, isn't seriously wrong, right? Because it just fails to bring into existence someone who could have been benefited from future goods. It doesn't actually deprive any existing individual of future goods. Okay, so as Jojo mentioned, this does not justify late-term abortion. So early fetuses. So you know, in the early, just to wrap up the early case. So early fetuses are not gametes. That's true. They're distinct organisms, but they aren't us either. They're just stages of bodies that we might inhabit. So like gametes, they won't experience future goods, even if they survive. So death deprives them of nothing. On the other hand, late-term fetuses are a different game entirely. Marquis seems right about them, broadly speaking. So after 20 to 28 weeks developmental age, there's a mental individual. She'll have a future like ours if you don't kill her. So there are serious moral objections to killing her. Now, one thing Jojo did mention, which I'll just very briefly touch on because I know I'm almost out of time, is, well, hey, there's no one moment. And I agree, there's no one moment. So it's pretty, so here's what we can say. It's pretty unlikely that fetuses have mental states at 20 weeks. It's extremely likely, overwhelmingly likely that they do at 28 weeks. This is also likely vague and a matter of degree. So clearly what to say in this case, on my view, is that the moral objection to abortion increases steadily as the probability, determinacy, and robustness of mental life and persistence increases. So at 20 weeks, I think there's a small chance of inflicting an enormous harm. At 28 weeks, there's an enormous chance of an enormous harm. And prior to 20 weeks, there's an extremely remote chance of harm, but it increases from virtually zero to a bit greater. So I think that can sort of explain our sense that abortion becomes more objectionable the later in pregnancy you get. But yeah, when you get to 28, you know, close to 28 weeks, I think just like infanticide, it's deeply, deeply morally problematic. And if you want to hear more, come in September. Or maybe we'll deal with it a bit more today. Great, well, thanks so much. Do you want me to switch anything or turn anything off, or switch back to yours?
Thank you. So now Jojo will be taking it back for 10 minutes with his response.
Just wait, let me set this up, please.
Oh, sorry, is it not on yours?
That should be.
So I switched it back to you.
There. Perfect. Thanks, Dr. Nyos. Like I said, I appreciate spending time with him. He is, we actually agree on a lot, and I'm really grateful that we can do that. One thing, obviously, that we don't agree with is the premise that I started with, which is that human rights belong to human beings. And notice, I don't know if he actually directly addressed that, because he's agreed that it's an organism, it's a human organism, but somehow he's disagreeing on the fact that it has human rights because it doesn't have a mind. So the question that we need to ask at this point then is, where does this organism go? If it's something completely different, if it's something that is just a shell, where does this shell go once we get to 20 weeks when a mind exists? So this premise given to me by my friends Clinton Wilcox, Alexander Proust, who are pro-life ethicists as well, is this. It is wrong to intentionally kill an innocent human being. Abortion intentionally kills an innocent human being. Therefore, abortion is wrong. So the premise they start off with is this. I am either identical to the fetus that was in my mother's womb, or I am not identical to it. You can see that's part of our debate tonight, is it not? Either it's me in there, or it's something else. Now, if I'm not identical to the fetus, then the fetus is either dead or still alive, but separate from me. But it has to go somewhere, doesn't it? It can't just cease to exist. So it's either dead or separate. But if the fetus is dead, then it died by gaining an ability that was in its programming to develop. Now, does something die simply because it's gained an ability that's part of its programming? I don't think so. Neither do they. Things don't die because they gain an ability. That is in one's programming to develop. They're still alive. That's why they have the programming. Therefore, the conclusion is the fetus is not dead. Make sense? In terms of the philosophy students here? Premise 4, if the fetus is alive, but separate from me, then either A, two numerically different things occupy the same space at the same time, or place at the same time, or B, I am not my body, but my fetus is. Okay, let me read that again. If the fetus is alive, but separate from me, then either A, two numerically different things occupy the same place at the same time, or B, I am not my body, but my fetus is. But the premise 5 speaks to that. A violates a plausible law of physics. Two things cannot occupy the same space at the same time. And B entails absurd consequences, such as rape being merely a property crime and not a crime against a person. We don't just have crimes against bodies, we have crimes against people. We have crimes against humans who have human rights. Therefore, the conclusion from these two premises is the fetus cannot be alive, but separate from me. Neither of those seem to work. Premise 6, if the fetus is not dead, and if the fetus cannot be alive but separate from me, then I am the same thing as the fetus. If it's not dead, or if it's not separate from me, then the thing that was growing in the womb is still me. They argue this by saying I'm the same thing as the fetus, and if I'm the same thing as the fetus, and the fetus has a right to life, since I have a right to life, essentially. And that's important. Remember my premise. Human beings have human rights. If some human beings do not have human rights, then who gets to determine that? Who gets to place that value? And it's interesting, I'm glad Dr. and I pointed it out. I don't think that aliens should not have human rights. Of course they should, if they're like us. But you notice what I asked and you didn't answer. If we were to find a Vulcan fetus or a Klingon fetus, would we treat it like a cockroach, just another kind of organism, or we would say, Eureka, we found intelligent life? I think most scientists would say, Eureka, we found intelligent life, even if that zygote, even that Vulcan fetus did not have those abilities that we have currently now. Why? Because of what it is inherently, not because of its current abilities. The conclusion then that they give is that therefore the fetus has a right to life, and therefore abortion is immoral. Elective abortion is immoral because what we're killing is just something like us. Biologically then, I want to go back to some of his arguments, because the argument I'm making is quite simple. What we're talking about when we're talking about an organism that exists in the womb is that it's something like us. It's just us at different stages of development. And because it's not just a something, it's a stage of development, there's certain rights that we have. He talks about how we have to look at value based on whether or not we can experience something in the future. But remember, abortion destroys not just a current human being, but the entire future of that human being. And when we think about what abortion actually does, the values that it actually takes away, we need to remember these are experiences that we're depriving someone else of because we've decided that they're not like us for some reason, based on their current ability, inherently based on their age. That's why I want to show you a video of what abortion actually does. And let me warn you, this video is graphic, it's very difficult to see, but it's the reality of what happens 300 times every day in our country. And let me warn you, if you do not want to watch it, you're welcome to just close your eyes. You don't have to watch it. We're not here to force you to watch it. But it is evidence for the discussion that we're having, because we want to be able to point out what it actually destroys, like Dr. and I referenced. In fact, I agree with the pro-choice activist Naomi Wolf, who said, how can we charge that it's violent repulsive for pro-lifers to brandish violent repulsive images if the images are real? To insist that the truth is in poor taste is the very height of hypocrisy. This is a university. This is what we're supposed to talk about. Reality. Even if we don't agree with it, this is how it works. By the way, when I show these images, I always reference a woman that I met in Winnipeg, a mother who was pro-life, was at a conference that I was speaking at. And when I showed these images, she came to me afterwards and said, you know, I had an abortion before I became pro-life. My kids were at this conference, they don't even know about it. But as I saw those images, it broke my heart. It hurt so much. But please keep showing it, because if it keeps someone else from making the same choice I did, then it's worth the pain. We don't show these images to condemn anybody. We do show these images because intellectual honesty requires us to actually understand what's going on. except for the last one, are the first and second trimester, the very abortions that Dr. Nye is trying to defend. But by the way, all those abortions are perfectly legal in Canada. At late-term abortions, there was a case even just a few months ago in Quebec where a woman was trying to have an abortion at 30 weeks, was not allowed. The Quebec government is actually investigating to make sure she gets her abortion at 30 weeks. Fetuses can survive, as Dr. Nye said, at 23. My last point, I think, is an important one too. Just because you don't know what you are deprived of, that doesn't justify depriving you. Just because you may not know what's going on around you, just because you may not know what you may not get in the future, that knowledge is not available to you, doesn't give me the right to deprive you of that future. It's interesting, when we, a few years ago, there was a case in Toronto where the University of Toronto actually allowed for bathrooms to be non-gendered. Anyone can use them. What happened within a couple of months is that they caught 2 guys filming women in their showers. And of course, they had to change the policy right away to have some gendered bathrooms. But just because those women may not have heard or known that there were peeping toms in the bathroom, did that justify those peeping toms? Our lack of knowledge of the future, our lack of knowledge of what's going on, or that we don't have certain kinds of rights, doesn't give someone else the right to deprive of those rights. The future does not belong to them if we're human beings, because human beings have human rights. Let me close by talking about a young boy here named Noah Markham. Noah was the youngest survivor of the Katrina flood. And how he survived is actually an interesting story, because the Toronto Star reported this, of all places, not even a pro-life newspaper. It said this: cells saved from flood, now baby Noah Markham. Rescued from a great flood while he was just a frozen embryo in liquid nitrogen, a baby boy entered the world yesterday who was named after the most famous flood survivor of them all, Noah. The question I would leave you, and you want you to think about, is when Noah was rescued as an embryo, what was being rescued? A shell, a different kind of organism? Or was it just Noah at a different stage of development? Because if that's the case, then doesn't it make sense that even when he was at that stage, he deserved the same human rights that you and I do? Because human beings deserve human rights. Thank you.
Now, Professor Nye will have 10 minutes to reply.
Thanks so much. And thanks so much, Jojo. Let me maybe just get out of the way a quick point of hearty agreement. Yes, I entirely agree that just because you don't know what you're being deprived of doesn't mean you aren't being deprived of it, and that it's ethically a harm, all just the same, right? And so that's very important. So sometimes individuals try to justify the view that there's nothing wrong with painlessly killing non-human animals because they don't know what they're going to be deprived of, and I think that's very clearly false. It doesn't matter, right, whether you can actually foresee what you're being deprived of. It matters that it would have been good for you and that it's not you who's experiencing it. So I think, yeah, our entire disagreement, right, we agree with about a lot of things. It really just centers on whether sort of early fetuses persist as us in an ethically relevant sense. That's the entire. I think that's pretty much the entire ethically relevant thing. Although yeah, there might be a few other things, but yeah, that's certainly the central issue. Just a few clarifications about how to phrase things around this, though, given that we have that disagreement. Of course, it's question begging against, and I know you've argued for review, but it is question begging against me to say that Noah existed in liquid nitrogen, right? My own view is that the organism that Noah now inhabits so existed, but not Noah, the mental individual who experiences goods. And I know you put pressure on me, so I'll respond to that in a second. The other thing is just again about question begging. I think you mentioned that at various points, I think you've been sort of slipping between the term human organism and human beings, right? So I'm not granting that important moral rights belong to human organisms, right? I grant that they belong to human beings, but the whole thing about them being beings is that they're the kinds of things that can be harmed and benefited in a morally important sense. And I've given this argument that that involves them being mental individuals, to do with Abby and Brittany and to do with the brain transplant stuff, which again doesn't have to be actual. And if you want to do it the way John Locke did it, we could just imagine the mental states just randomly being being transferred. So I really, but yes, you've given this argument about persistence. What are the metaphysics of sort of our fetuses versus us? And I think that's great. Oh shoot, I thought I had this thing in here. But yeah, so I do think, I mean, yeah, just to give you the short story. So let me go on premise. So I am going to say, yeah, I'm not going to say our fetuses that the fetuses that give rise to us cease to exist. Not going to say that. So I think then we're into premise 4, and I think it was, so you had 2A is 2A is the fetuses cease to exist. Yeah, not going to say that the fetuses cease to exist. Yes, so 2B is that the fetuses persist, but not as us, right? So yeah, so that's exactly what I want to say. The early fetus that gave rise to me was an early stage of the organism that I now inhabit, right? So I, though, am not my organism because, again, I could survive the death of my organism via brain transplant, and my organism could survive my death if my cerebrum was destroyed and someone else's, and maybe someone else's was transferred in there, or maybe I was just kept on life support for a very long period of time. So again, I'm not, so my view is that I'm not my organism, I inhabit my organism. Now, as Jojo pointed, following some other authors, Jojo said, well, isn't my view going to entail that rape is not a crime against an individual or a mental individual, but it's a property crime? And I think that doesn't clearly follow. So certainly, in most cases of sexual assault, it has a lot of extremely deleterious mental events. Also, for a lot of individuals, it frustrates things that they didn't want to happen. Those, again, also seem to be things that are happening to a mental individual. So just because it's happening primarily, or in the first instance to the body, doesn't mean that the mental individual isn't affected. So I think I'd be very happy to sort of point out those things with, in all the, almost all cases of rape, there are going to be all those mental effects, and even effects on the mental individual if they don't notice anything, right? Because their autonomous preferences over their own body are being violated. So now you might say, well, what about? So I guess that, because the hardest sorts of cases for me, presumably, right, would be rape while unconscious that's never noticed. What about if after you die, if someone messes with your body through necrophilia kind of thing? I mean, in a certain sense, after you die and someone messes with your body through necrophilia, that's not really going to help the living organism view either, because you'd have to say, well, the organism ceased to exist, but then there's still a rape, and that seems bad. I assume, sort of having your body raped after you die, or having your body sexually assaulted after you die when you didn't want that to happen is a problem. So we both have to explain those sorts of things. I think, clearly the way I think I'd be most inclined to do it is by saying that they violate the autonomous preferences of the individual, and again, that's something that's happening to a mental individual with autonomous preferences. So just a few things to clarify about my view and some of the sort of weirdnesses of it, maybe the bit about Noah. So, I mean, I do think, even though I do think that sort of strictly as a matter of ethical importance, we're distinct from organisms, we might use our organisms to refer to each other, and I think that's fine. I just don't think there's any ethical weight that needs to be put in it. So we might say, well, which human adult is that? It's Bob. Remember back when Bob was a late fetus? I think that's kind of what you're doing with Noah. I think it's fine to say, yeah, sure. I mean, we're just sort of aligning the morally important distinction between Bob, the morally important individual, and Bob, the organism he inhabits. But that's fine. I wouldn't put any ethical stock in this talk, though, and part of the reason, again, is that you can do it with dead organisms, which Jojo, I think, would agree aren't us. We're not going to persist through death. So one day Bob will be a corpse, and then Bob will be just dust. We're going to see Uncle Bob in the funeral home before we bury him. So again, we can use our names to refer to our organisms. It doesn't really carry any ethical weight. I do think, though, that, and this is one thing that might have been caught up in when I'm worried about question begging, adult human and late fetus are actually ambiguous. They can refer either to the organism or the mental individual, whereas early fetus refers univocally to the organism. Also, just to clarify, I'm not saying that early fetuses have interests, but we don't have to respect them because they're not all rational and cool, right? Not my view at all. So if two beings have the same interests in something, we must, absent special obligations and so on, give those interests equal weight. Intelligence, active experience is no better reason to give less weight to an interest than like race or sex. But this doesn't mean that all entities have the same interests. So you should care equally about those who are under anesthesia and not. But it's okay to cut those under anesthesia, but not those not under anesthesia because they have different interests, right? So as I said, I'm not saying I'm saying that early fetuses have an interest in continued existence, but we don't have to care about it because they don't have minds. I'm saying they have no interest in morally relevant interest in continued existence. Like arms and legs, they aren't the sorts of things that can be literally benefited by future existence. In fact, they can't experience momentary benefits or harms either, so they aren't the sorts of entities that can have interests, morally inconsiderable interests in anything, so they aren't beings, right? So that's the actual view. Now, oh yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to ignore the Vulcan fetus thing. So if we found a Vulcan fetus, that would be extremely cool. I mean, I don't think though that I think that our scientific and maybe aesthetic interests in it don't show though that Vulcan fetus actually has an interest in continued existence. So again, suppose we actually found a whole bunch of Vulcan fetuses, and we found some adult Vulcans, though, right? And we either had to choose between, sort of preserving the lives of the Vulcan fetuses or the adult Vulcans. Well, at least I've given an argument that we really should care about the adult Vulcans because the Vulcan fetuses aren't going to be harmed. So I think to the extent that we say, oh wow, we found intelligent life. I mean, I'm not sure I don't think we're saying that like there's something that's currently intelligent, or and it certainly doesn't entail that there's something that that right now has an interest in future survival. It's just we found something that, hey, could very easily give rise to this new kind of sentient, whole new kind of sentient, intelligent being, and wouldn't that be cool? So that, yeah, it would, and it would be interesting, but that doesn't show that that entity itself has the interest or is directly morally considerable. So I think that, I was just trying to see if there's anything else. Yeah, I mean, so again, I mean, just to clarify, I'm not saying that the whole thing is whether early fetuses really are us and persist as us and enjoy our goods. So if that's false, it's not discrimination against them to say they don't have an interest in continued survival. That's just the truth. So on the other hand, if it's true that they have an interest in continued survival and they persist as us, I totally agree. Death is going to harm them. As I said, that Don Marquis argument, that would be what would convince me that early abortion was morally wrong, if anything would. So I think that would be exactly the right way to do it. But I hope I've I've done my best to defend the view that in fact, the most plausible thing to say is in fact that early fetuses don't persist as us, and because we can come apart from our organisms, they're just organisms that give rise to us, and we have it later. So that's it. Thank you.
Can we take a quick break? Yeah, definitely. So just another thank you for both our speakers for coming out today. So we are going to take a quick 10-minute break, and after the break, we're going to be having a question and answer. So the way that we're taking in questions is not by just coming up and then answering questions, but we're going to take them online. That way we can group similar questions together, and then also just like speed things up a little bit. So if you wanted to ask Howard a code, that would be right in menti.com.
Do you guys want me to type it on the laptop?
Oh, yeah. So
sure.
You're going to submit them online. So you're going to enter into the website is menti.com, and then it's going to ask you for a code. If you want to ask Howard questions, then you enter Howard's code, and then Jojo's code is going to be on the other side. And we will resume in 10 minutes. So that would be that'd be 10 to 8.
What if you can't ask questions online?
Yeah. So if you want a backup system.
We're the ones who'll be taking the questions through the online, and we'll be passing them along. So give your questions to us on a piece of paper. That'd be fine. Yeah. So let's.
Is that right, guys?
So I'm 8.88.
And so we're
The back of the survey.
for that. But look up which is going to be computing. We'll also post the numbers that they just put up on the board so that it's nice. So like as a reporter or young that you can ask your questions on that. All right.
Sure, this is not for me. This is for you. Yes. Here you go. And here's some paper. Oh yes, you're right.
It's better than the last one.
Yeah, and ended up sitting right over there.
So
I understand it's like what is it? Because like system of what you think.
Anyone else want paper?
I like his because it's actually makes sense. Where he's not just like but
Okay, we'll turn it on. We haven't opened it yet. Okay, we'll do that.
it borders on a very glossy that talks about emotions,
And what a person is. Yeah, it has a lot to do with what a person is. And like that's a very wishy-washy.
I would argue that it's still
So basically it's like there's a vessel, and then if that vessel gets a fully functioning brain, then that brain gives that vessel personhood. So that's basically
yeah, because let's say that it's that a consciousness is what a human being, like that's the being that has value and rights. But then,
So most of the questions should be open by now. Sorry about that.
like he said if we discovered an alien that's just like really simple as people, wouldn't it be treated the same like with the person that you use? Honestly, I don't know.
Really.
I would also say there was a difference between recognizing that another species is valuable and having the right saying that humans are kind of in a sense arguing it's like how human rights versus animal rights. You can believe in one without believing in the other at the same time.
I fully embrace the title of the species. I fully embrace it.
Yeah. It's really...
I don't feel bad about saying if you discovered a conscious alien life.
So was that a good introduction to the video?
I hope Janice answered the question. I know she was
Absolutely. I wonder what I can check. I think I'll just leave that. Yeah, it's a really big selection. I should put, I mean, so the foster report is the media bus, and then there was Ingham and all. That was the UK one. I would be really interested because Foster and Kimball was like drawing clothes on the news, but Ingham and all was different. So thanks again. It was super helpful for this, but it'll be really helpful for the future. Yeah, thanks again. Oh God, I got one. I was just are you going to have to take off right for Calgary? Okay.
We're just passing my ride.
Yeah, because we were planning for grants. If you would like, I would love to. Love our dad.
Friday's my.
I don't know, like I wrote my thing that I want to ask questions.
I'm sorry, I didn't get this response.
No, you said. I there's no way, earthly way you
right,
ever
almost
should
all
have
of it
any
are.
business
Almost all of
opportunity.
it
So
are,
don't worry at all. I'd love to chat more. And I'm sorry if I wasn't able to, sound out what you did. I just sort of felt like I had to get out the basics of the argument that you're responding to. Exactly. So no, I really,
I'm being sincere when I say
Who's this question for? This is for
you should just let him know that.
So we'll do 2 minutes for the individual to whom it's directed, and then 1 minute if the other party wants to follow up.
Sure. And you could time that as well. I know I need to. Do you have the 2 and the 1? We just have the 1. We'll do that. Okay. Yeah. So just helps. Okay.
Sure.
Yeah, that was actually.
Yeah. Actually, could anyone improvise in 30 seconds? If I had another piece of paper, I could do it. Just write a little. Just write like 30.
It's better than usually.
Is that visible?
Yeah, because that helps me.
We'll know, because it's like a crappy hand job thing. So, yeah, we'll know what it is. We'll know.
Sorry.
No, it's fine. No, I'm excited. I just, yeah, we'll have to see what else is
Yeah, just put it on Google Docs and then share the Google Docs linkage just like that. It's the only thing I can think of. Not easy for my phone, like it would be something I have to do.
You just stand in front of the podium, make it better.
And the other thing is also if you want to jot anything down, like while the other parties talk, or like you have.
Well, if it's a slide, we just convert it to PDF.
Oh, okay. Well, do you want to do it in front of us?
I guess I'll just say, I just don't want to do something different from you if you're
Oh,
standing.
well, I can do it in front of you. Like, I can do it in front of you.
We do have the mic, so just for those folks back there, I guess.
All right, no, that's okay.
I didn't think of it. We need to have that mic right there.
I never used those, because I think I'm too loud.
I have to say, I only took this last few classes in university. It really is something they should bring back.
Oh, yes. Well, we can try.
Just doing something that's basically logic training, or what I say, something that's my own
Obviously, it's like just got learned.
especially this dance. This guy,
Just need to see
She said doesn't matter. So
whoever has less questions.
We'll take a minute and a half on it.
Yeah, we're starting.
Very much. I'm sorry.
Oh no, I made a little bit of
Whatever field you go, we're talking basic skills, reason and logic.
So you're fine with that. But yeah, exactly. So it would have been easier.
Yeah. It would be more easier for me to go. When everyone else is starting to also around the 6th,
Starting on the double chill, yeah.
It's like there was
the entire thing needs to go after background.
Interest. Future interest. But since it's developing,
Someone's saying that organized code is working for the test.
Always try
monitor or and basically just try
there's a sense of ruin. It's the traditional liberal views. That's what the other way
I think they look at hard times.
I'm pretty sure they were showing us that.
I don't know, it's probably better to like, hey, someone's here having trouble with it, or you can questions.
maybe now that she was handling I was not. So we could have, what's going on right now?
Well, all you know, it's these conferences in South Africa, it's science from scratch.
They said that they're getting a bunch right now. Probably just because they were trying to do it before.
I know.
What's the evidence? If you had evidence, they only got they haven't checked out the results. Oh, and by the way, what they had everything with this one class.
Again, I think we agree on this.
You guys all got surveys before we started today, so I just wanted to remind you guys that once we're done today to either leave them on the table up in the front or at the back over there, or we can hand them to Ramsey, who is sitting right there. We can wait. So just remember to have this back afterwards.
All right, cool. We have a lot of questions. This is great. You guys have submitted like a ton. It's awesome. We won't be able to get through all of them because of limited time. So every question is going to be 2 minutes for the person that's asked to, and then 1 minute to reply if they want to. Okay. And the first question is for Dr. Nye. Someone says it gives you a thought experiment.
Okay.
Gives you a thought experiment. Okay. Your daughter is in a deep coma from an accident. Let's say that we know for sure that she will wake up after 10 months.
Okay.
Let's say that we know she will start to regain brain function at 20 weeks. When your daughter awakes, she will have to relearn everything again, from speaking to writing, etc., just like a fetus. If a maniac came and stabbed your comatose daughter at 10 weeks, before developing the brain function, so this is like pre-20 weeks, do you think that this maniac didn't do anything wrong?
Right. Well, thanks so much. No, I think it's got the makings of a great thought experiment, which is actually very similar to some others that have been suggested by individuals like Bernard Williams with his deprogramming thought experiment and others. And it's a great question. So maybe one thing just to quickly clarify, this thing about continuing as a mental individual that I've been defending, it's actually a very wide family of views. And there's many different ones within it. And actually, I've sort of hinted in agreeing with Jojo about certain things that I disagree with some individuals who hold different views about what it takes to be a continuing mental individual. So the crucial thing I would think is, and it sounded like with coma and with the general understanding of coma, so if you've got someone in a coma, their center of consciousness is still intact. It's just not producing consciousness, right? So, I mean, my view on the matter is that as long as you have, what we essentially are is we're mental, so we're as well-being subjects, we're centers of subjective experience, and so we persist as long as our center of consciousness persists. So if it's an ordinary coma, her center of consciousness is going to persist. And that's going to be true even if she has to learn stuff from scratch. As long as you've got enough just mental, brain hardware and everything, so functioning thalamocortical system, or Bjorn-Merker's right, functioning midbrain, vagal ganglion, diencephalic system. If you've got that continuous the whole way through, yeah, that's your daughter from beginning to end and she survives. Now, if that was broken, if it was just like her neurons got broken down and then just randomly a different brain was constructed out of that, I would think that my daughter would have perished. And that the individual who comes out of the other end would not be my daughter. But yeah, I don't think you actually need continuity of particular. I take it that in the coma she lost a whole bunch of like beliefs and desires and stuff. Yeah, so I don't think that you actually need persistence of those, and that's where I depart from some. Like in some ways, Jeff McMahon or Derek Parfit, who think, yeah, it's really about persistence of particular mental states. Although fetuses have quite a bit of that, and you can see it in the references on my slides. Yeah.
Well, just quickly, we go back to what is it? What is it that individual? Is it just a body at that point, or is it just the same individual, same organism, just at different stages, or even different mental states? Like someone with amnesia who wakes up and they don't remember anything about their past. Are they now a new individual? Does the law give them a new identity? No, we try to restore that identity because we realize something, and this is something with the thought experiment about the brain. The brain cannot function by itself. Reason does not walk around by itself. It's attached to an organism, and that organism is a human person. And so in this situation, it would be very the same thing. It's a human individual, human organism, whether it's in a coma or not, and that does not change when he or she wakes up.
Thank you.
Okay. So this scenario was given to the both of you guys, but probably more likely to speak with Jojo. So the scenario is where a young person is pregnant and their parents kick them out. What kind of choice would they have if going through the pregnancy will harm them?
Well, again, that's a terrible scenario, a terrible tragedy. I would never even want to consider putting myself in that situation or understanding it. But I have talked to people who have faced that kind of similar kinds of situations. It really goes back to my question: what is it? Are we justified in killing a born child for that very reason? If the scenario was different, the woman already had a 1-year-old. She was kicked out of her home because she got pregnant. Her parents changed their mind and said, "You have to live on the streets now." At that point, would the mother have the right to kill the 1-year-old? Canadian law says no, because why? It's an individual, it's a human being. I would argue biologically, we also know the fetus is a human being, just younger than us, and therefore should not be killed just because of that scenario.
I really like the way Jojo was reasoning and responding to the question that we ought to compare it to what about a born infant? So is there a defensible difference between fetuses and born infants, given that I think it is right that we ought not, that it would be wrong to kill a born infant just because she was a burden to her parents, and the parents were in great difficulties. There are some philosophers, again, like Michael Tooley, who have argued that death doesn't harm born infants even. because they can't conceive of their futures. But again, Jojo and I both think that's wrong. I think we need to explain why it's wrong, but I think that the best explanation of why it's wrong is that what really matters is that they have, they persist as a center of consciousness, not just sort of an organism that, again, could be the sort of thing that was brain dead, and, you know, that, yeah. So I think it's not just that we happen to think that infanticide is wrong, we need to justify it, and I think the best justification is going to be the sort of thing I've given.
Next question for Howard. What do you think of the pro-choice argument of bodily autonomy?
Right. Well, that's okay. So I think someone was trying to cue me up. So it's certainly a very interesting argument. And if my slides come on quick enough, I actually have one prepared. Yeah. Is it? Oh, sorry. Yeah. Is that it? There it is. There it is. Okay. Yeah. Was I right on it? Oh shoot. Yeah. So yeah, please don't. Yeah, so Jojo's willing to give me a little more time. Yeah, so I think the best version of the bodily autonomy argument was that presented by Judith Jarvis Thompson, right? So the idea is, her idea is the considerations of bodily autonomy often make elective abortion morally permissible, even if the general objections to killing fetuses are just as strong as general objections to killing us, right? Which I think is largely true of when you get very late term, and Jojo thinks is true all the way along. And the thing she does to motivate this is she gives this famous violinist thought experiment. So you wake up in bed with a famous unconscious violinist, he has a fatal kidney alienated, and the Society of Music Lovers has found that you alone have the right blood type to help. They've therefore kidnapped you and plugged you, the violinist's circulatory system into yours so that your kidneys can be used to extract toxins from his blood, as well as yours. In 9 months, the violinist will have recovered and be safely unplugged from you. So is it morally permissible to unplug from the violinist? Thompson says, yes, it's your body, and she presumes that most other individuals will have this reaction. I think that's wrong. I actually think, no, it's wrong. It would not be okay to unplug from the violinist. The violinist needs me, and the cost to me is very small in comparison to the harm to him of death. I think we systematically underestimate the strengths of our duties of beneficence. I think, clearly it's wrong. We can see how strong these can be in cases where it's up close, and and we don't have this confusion about, oh, the side music lovers, I'll get them, right? If it's wrong not to save a child drowning right in front of you, even though this requires you to use your body, for example, to pick her up. And I think the best explanation of that, what seems very plausibly to make that true, is Singer's weak principle. If you can prevent something very bad from happening by incurring costs to yourself that are very small in comparison, then you're morally required to do so. And this does entail that many other things we often do, like spend on luxuries, as opposed to donate the proceeds to those who could use them to help the least advantaged, are also morally impermissible, but I think it's the truth. So we'll probably have to change a lot of other things about how we live when we understand why this argument isn't decisively successful, but I think we should be changing those other things about the way we live too.
I actually agree with most of that, probably, not too surprised, but there's something more. The violinist analogy actually fails, because it's not comparable to abortion. In the situation of abortion, it's more comparable if you were to say this. What if you were the one who poisoned the violinist in the first place? Or that violinist is actually your child? What moral duties do you have as a parent for that child that you've poisoned? At that point, we have parental responsibilities. There's the law in Alberta that actually says that if you don't provide for the necessities of life for your child, it's actually child abuse. So in this situation that Thompson argues, it's actually not abortion. Abortion is not just unplugging a fetus, it's actually tearing it apart, as you saw. And more than that, we don't have capital punishment for using someone else's body. So even if it was the case that this fetus is unjustly using a woman's body, we don't kill the fetus because it's violated the law if, as Thompson agrees, the fetus is a human person or human being that has value. At the very most, we can evict her, but we can't kill her.
Okay. So next question for Jojo. Why would an abortion be considered a human right?
Why would abortion be considered a human right? I guess it goes back to my question, right? When it talks about what abortion is, we're talking about the ending of a human life. Therefore, it can't be a human right if it ends someone else's life. And in the case of elective abortion, we're ending that life for reasons that we would not end a born person's life. Therefore, if abortion is killing a born person for those reasons is wrong, ending the life of a preborn child is also wrong for those very same reasons.
Yeah, and I think I have probably very little to add to that, since I think the question of at what point abortion is a human right really depends on whether abortion harms fetuses in the way it harms us. And of course, the failure of maybe something like the Thompson argument. No, it's okay. And I guess maybe because it's a bit relevant, this could be considered a continuation of the explanation of why, given what Jojo and I have sort of agreed on, we shouldn't think we're wrong, and that the crucial issue of making a human right is bodily autonomy. I guess I just sort of mentioned, also to kind of my way of getting at what I think Jojo was saying. In the violinist, right, you bear no responsibility for your situation, so that seems analogous only to abortion in cases of rape. Now, I do think that the Thompson case is a little interesting for thinking about cases of rape, and might justify why some think that abortion in case of rape is at least morally different, even if we think that it's actually still wrong to unplug from the violinist. But yeah, so in other cases, you can foresee that you're doing something that might result in someone existing, and you might say, well, does this give you a stronger duty to hate the fetus? I think the relevant thing about the fetus being your child is that, you brought her into existence, and because existence isn't a benefit, it's a precondition for harm and benefit. It makes her, it's not like you can say, oh, well, I've already helped her, why do I have to help her more? Instead, it makes her vulnerable to the harms of life, and that wasn't something that was sort of already benefiting her. So I think that helps justify a stronger duty to protect her, in this case, by adjusting.
Thanks, I agree with that, folks.
Howard, the next question is if technology advances to the point where a fetus can survive outside the womb at any stage, would this technological change alter your present positions on abortion?
Yes. So I think maybe I think that's a really great thing to think about. And I mean, a lot of this has to do with what you're going to think about the status of embryos and destroying human embryos and things like that. So basically, I think I'd basically say it wouldn't change the basic ethical position. So if you've got these fetuses existing outside ex utero, if they're before the point where they have mental states, it's going to be okay to destroy them. But again, to avoid the risks, you want to do it as early as possible. If they're past as they get closer to having mental states, and as you're in that range, it gets extremely morally risky, and you ought not do so. Now, presumably, I don't know how this gestating is working, so maybe I should just even mention, those of us who have companion birds who are in mated pairs are actually in this situation. So before, it's very important because with birds you can't really safely spay and neuter them. So if you're going to do birth control, you kind of have to take away fertilized eggs early. When I do it as early as possible because I don't want there to be a sentient being who I'm depriving of future goods. So if they get too late, you've got babies on your hand and you have to care for them. Now, with typical human adults, presumably these would be like these might be the fetuses of other couples who want to gestate them. So I think there would be, again, I'm sorry, I realize if you think that early fetuses are the kinds of entities that can be harmed by death, this will sound awful, but that's really kind of the whole debate. I really do think it would be essentially a property crime to destroy someone else's early. It would be morally objectionable quad destroying someone's property and projects. Because we're not talking about the law, we're talking about ethics, right? If you were to destroy one of these way pre-20-week fetuses developing ex utero?
I think that's a great question. Obviously, we didn't really talk about viability this debate this time, but viability really is a product both of biology and technology. So a fetus that is viable in Canada may not be viable if born premature, say, in my country, the Philippines, or other parts of the world. So viability is not the way we should measure someone's value. That's basic technology. That being said, I really like the question because it really begs the point in terms of what is the fetus? What is it? Is it just a shell? Is it just a different kind of organism? Or is it just the stage of development of what we are? And I think that's a great point to make. We understand what the fetus is in terms of the stage of development, because as we look at that fetus developing outside the womb in that case, we would understand that there is no point where it actually ceases to become a human. It's still a human organism, still a human being.
Okay. So the next question is actually for the both of you. So is it possible to find an answer without needing to define the nature or state of being of the fetus?
Can you speak one more time?
Yeah. Is it possible to find an answer without needing to define the nature or state of the fetus?
Yeah, so one thing I should probably say about the way I've been doing this, about like, you know, what it is essentially. I mean, I think that the crucial question is really the ethics of what matters in persistence, right? And whether for ethical purposes, fetuses at various ages of gestation count as persisting as us. There are reasons to think that these are not strictly questions of numerical identity. Although I think that they should be related. So Derek Parvin has a very famous thought experiment where it's, okay, suppose each of your cerebral hemispheres could support all of your mental states. There are some individuals with like not that much different bilateral segregation. So suppose your cerebral hemispheres were sort of, again, very far in the future, separated and transplanted into different individuals, and they both, you know, were fully mentally continuous with you. What should we say about a case like that? Well, it seems that, you know, you're going to be mentally continuous with both of them, so it seems like at least as good as ordinary survival for you. On the other hand, it doesn't seem that we can say that either of them are exactly the same as you. Because if we do say that they're the same as you, then it looks like we're saying that they're numerically identical to each other, and that can't be right, because surely they're distinct individuals, right? Like just one of them, you know, once they're out there, you know, living their own lives, it's not as though just one of them dying is only as bad as, you know, someone losing half their brain back in the before division. So I think the perfect solution is the best one. You say, look, it's what matters. So you persist as both. You have what's ethically important as both, but you're not. It's not. You can persist even if you are not numerically identical to those you persist as. It's kind of weird, but that said, I mean, in the way I've been engaging in this whole debate, I've basically been kind of talking about numerical identity, because I think what we should do is we want to talk about numerical identity or who is identical to whom as close as possible to these ethical questions about persistence. So I think Jeff McMahon's view that sort of what identity is it's minimal non-branching what matters in persistence is the best way to go about it. And then if you do it like that, then it's fine in the non-branching cases to just talk about identity the way we've been doing. But the crucial questions are really questions of persistence and not just identity, right? Numerical identity.
No problem. Arthur Kaplan is the head of the Division of Medical Ethics at New York University School of Medicine. He actually agrees with Dr. Nye's position on the value of the fetus. But he says any kind of idea of head transplants, anyone who's willing to do that is out of their minds. Love the double entendre there. Why? Because it's not just possible, it's impossible just to think about your brain and moving it, or your spinal cord moving it to someone else's body, and then it becomes you. The fact is, we are human beings. We need all of these other parts. Your brain will cease to function after 5 minutes without oxygen. It needs lungs to do that. So when it comes to this kind of concept that we're inhabiting a body and our mind is in this body, and if we move our mind to another body, that still becomes us, it's not biologically possible. What he says actually in this article is that it's something that's not likely even possible to happen at all. And this is someone who agrees with his view on the value of the fetus. So he doesn't ground his view in terms of whether or not we can do brain transplant. He argues another thing. But going back to in terms of understanding why we value or how we value entities, Dr. Nye mentioned that we don't think the fetus and us is identical. I didn't say they were identical in terms of biologically identical. Clearly, we've grown. But as the thought experiment, the challenge that my friends make here, Clinton Wilcox, he said, well, where does this body go when the brain comes in? Where does it disappear? Is it still there? Is it two beings in the same spot? Or is it something that actually is developed? It's something that is a unified organism that has all of these traits, it's just at different stages of development. Like I said, is it something else, or is it a stage of development? And I think clearly biologically it makes sense to believe that this organism in the womb is just us at a younger stage of development.
Thank you. This is for Professor Nye. You said that a fetus is just a stage of the body that we might inhabit. The first law of thermodynamics says you cannot get something from nothing. Therefore, who is the we and where does it come from?
Great. Yeah, no, excellent question. Just to clarify, it's, I mean, this question is obviously about early fetuses, right? And you know, one thing back when I was saying there's a lot of evidence that fetuses have continuity of beliefs and desires, and so I was talking about late fetuses, but it's really impressive. You know, late fetuses will be able to recognize their mother's voice ex utero. They'll like the same flavors that they got to taste in utero, right? These are all, I think, evidence of the kinds of mental continuity that late fetuses can have. But again, what really matters is persistence of center of consciousness, and I think this is evidence of persistence of center of consciousness, even though it doesn't constitute. So, we've got a pretty tight, this is really great because this gets into real issues about the nature of the mind and how the mind fits into the world. And if you're interested in these questions, in the philosophy department, we teach a course, Philosophy 205, Philosophy of Mind, and we do go seriously into this. But I think on all the leading views, dualism, neutral monism, functionalism, my own view, my favorite view, and of course numerical identity theory, that we are that mental states just are brain states. There's a very tight connection between us and our brains. So on all these different views, you basically find a way to say, well, look, so when you have brain states, you have mental states. I think the best way to do it is mental states just are brain states doing certain kinds of things which can be realized by different kinds of things. It wouldn't have to be neurons. It wouldn't have to be neurons in our configuration. It could, in principle, in the future, be silicon chips. Again, I wouldn't talk about, I think Jojo's way too fast to talk about what's biologically possible. Not possible using current technology, but we should be hesitant about what's biologically possible. In a lot of these cases, it doesn't even really matter if it's physically possible, it's just in the future. But yeah, so mental states are brain states doing certain things. So they're not something over and above the brain states. Just when the brain states are there, the mental states are there. And yeah, nothing else, nothing new beyond the brain states has to pop into existence.
Again, as human beings, we are special. I think we are because we are able to reason. We are able to do things that other organisms can't. But the question is not, can we do those things? The question is, what is the origin of those things? Is it simply something that somehow gets inserted like a software program into the fetus? Think about it. Even in his view, the early fetus is pretty extraordinary as something that's able to develop these things on its own. No one programs it. No one puts something in there to make it be able to think and reason and have all these mental states that he talks about. In other words, we have to ask this question, where do these mental states come from? Where does this ability to have consciousness come from? Even from that perspective that he's articulated, we have to be able to ask, why would we destroy something that has the capacity to look and act and think like us, just given enough time, just given a chance to grow? That's pretty special as a being, is it not? And if you're going to justify killing them, and 300 of them every day in Canada, legally funded, I think we need to be able to have a further discussion on what kind of value that organism should have.
So next question for Jojo. If elective abortion was made illegal again, what does society have to do to protect women who will seek out a dangerous illegal abortion?
Well, I was in the Philippines a few years ago, and I was actually working with a group called Pro-Life Philippines. And in this group, they actually went out and they lobbied for the law, they do education work, and they actually help women who go through crisis pregnancies with all kinds of great work that they provide. All the while, abortion is already illegal in the Philippines. See, my work as a pro-lifer does not end just because the law changes. My work as a pro-lifer will continue because people would still need help. And frankly, what we've seen, though, is when the law changes, the law is a reflection of societal changes as well. And in that case, when everybody agrees in a society that abortion is the taking of innocent human life, I don't think many people will want to have an abortion. And for those few people who will be having abortions, there'll be absolutely, I think, ways we can help. We're doing that now in the United States. There are more pregnancy care centers that are pro-life than our abortion clinics. Why? Because we want to put our money where our mouth is. We want people to know that we're here to help, even in that kind of situation.
Yeah, so this is an empirical question. Some of what Jojo got into about the efficacy of restrictions, legal and institutional, that I am interested in, but I really haven't done any work on. I'll just mention, I've heard other individuals make claims to the contrary. I've heard individuals claim that actually, if you tighten the abortion restrictions, you don't actually reduce the rate. I'm unfortunately a place where the stuff we're worried about might come apart. I've heard claims that, if you tighten the early restrictions, then you just get more late-term abortions. But I'm really interested in this. I don't really know about it. I just thought I'd mention that I've heard other evidence, and maybe over drinks I can hear Jojo's counter-evidence. I don't have a view either way. I will just say that, yeah, I think support is absolutely, so from my perspective, the stuff I'm worried about, late-term abortion and selective non-treatment and euthanasia of disabled infants, support's really important, and we should do everything we can as a society to support individuals who have these very serious burdens caring for these other individuals.
Can I just cite a quick stat with your permission?
Sure. Yeah.
So in Canada in 1970, the first year of legalized abortion, there were about 11,000 abortions performed. That's from Stats Canada. Today there are over 100,000 abortions performed. Legality does have an influence on abortion. When you make it legal, it becomes more popular.
All right, this next question is for Howard, or for Dr. Nye. Why shouldn't we get abortions within, I presume, within the 20 weeks for trivial reasons?
Yeah, and maybe that'll actually let me speak a bit to the last question. Or so the thing that Jojo had said to me before the last question. I guess two things that are worth mentioning. The one that I did kind of mention in my slides, I'm hesitant to sort of put them back up because I think I'll just waste time, is the uncertainty factor. So I think actually at 20 weeks, it's very unlikely you have a mental individual. You would have, it really is when you start getting up into 22 and things like that it starts getting really likely. But there's a small chance that 20-week-old infant fetuses are sentient and are mental individuals who would persist in the future. And I think because of that, and if they are and they would persist and they would enjoy an entire future of goods, by terminating them, you would be doing something that has a small chance of an enormous harm. And I think that's a highly salient reason against doing it. And in fact, if you're interested in that, I'm going to be doing another talk at the end of the month on this exact sort of reasoning in the context of climate change, right? That sort of, various individual carbon emissions might have a very small chance of causing harm, but because if they do cause harm, it'll be enormous harm. It's a small chance of a big harm. So, that's already at 20 weeks that the odds are very, very low. Now, before that, though, there is a chance that we've overlooked something. And I think it's extremely small, vanishingly small, but there's a tiny chance that we have overlooked something. And that gets greater and greater as you go from fertilization to 20 weeks. I think at fertilization, like morning after pill, I do think it's, I do basically think it's okay to take the morning after pill for trivial reasons. Because the chances of them being sentient and mental individuals is basically the chance of gametes being sentient. I think it's virtually nil. But when you get up to 15 weeks, there's a chance that we could have gotten something wrong. And so that's why I'd be a little hesitant. There's also the aesthetic-y stuff that Jojo mentioned, which is really cool that they could give rise to something. I'm not sure how to weigh those aesthetic reasons. I think they might be in there, but they're nowhere near the reasons, powerful moral reasons against depriving individuals of all future goods that you get when you're very likely into 24 to 28 weeks. Sorry.
So the question was, what trivial reasons, or should trivial reasons be allowed to justify abortions in the first 20 weeks or so? And obviously, if you take a pro-choice position where choice is absolute, then yeah, you should be able to have a choice for whatever reason you want. That includes sex selection abortions because your fetus is the wrong gender. That includes if a child is disabled. In Iceland now, almost 100% of babies diagnosed with Down syndrome are aborted. And they're talking about genocide of people with disabilities in that country. In other places like that, Canada's close to 80 or 90% as well. Oh, and that could include absolutely any reason that a person would want. Now, the thing is, when we talk about choice is never absolute. We don't have a right to choose to do whatever we want. There are limits to the choices we can make. That's why they're called laws. And when we talk about these kinds of abilities that we have, these rights that we have, rights also have responsibilities. We can't just do whatever we want. So at the end of the day, the question still goes back to that. What is this thing that we're actually saying that we have a right to terminate or kill? If it isn't a human being, then yeah, absolutely. Dr. Nye's right, we can do whatever we want with them. But if there is something there, there's something special there, and I've argued for that, even within his own worldview, that these organisms somehow develop to think like us. I think that should give us at least pause to say, well, we should do something before, or have a discussion before we say 300 of them should be killed every day in our country.
So next question for Jojo. I'm going to relate this back to the hunting analogy that you used. So there's that gray area of not knowing, is this a person, is this not a person? So bringing that back to consciousness. So if we knew exactly when consciousness came into effect, as opposed to having some gray area, would that change the way we saw abortion before 20 years?
Well, go back to the hunting analogy. Let's go back to that. If the person in the bushes was unconscious, would we still be allowed to shoot them at that point? See, it's not the function of the ability of the individual, it's what that individual is. It's not their current capacity, it's their inherent capacity. So if we talk about a fetus, even if we were to know exactly the point when consciousness comes from, where it starts, we still have to ask where it came from. It comes from the organism, it comes from that ability. Reason and consciousness do not exist on their own. They're functions of the organism. And like I said, if that organism is a human being, that human being is deserving of human rights.
I guess I should say briefly, I was trying to stay away from it, but I do think there's extremely powerful reasons against killing non-human animals. Particularly, I believe in the bear hunting case, it would be for sport. And yeah, it's true, they're not capable of abstract reasoning, but that doesn't mean that they're not able to benefit from life every bit as much as humans that have comparable capacities that are severely intellectually disabled, for example. Yeah, and now if you just tried saying something like, those with severe intellectual disabilities have this inherent capacity that will never be actualized, and that's somehow important, that just seems extremely implausible. Why should, and similarly here, I mean, if the idea is that embryos have this capacity that might or might not be to give rise to something, I don't think that that's going to be very morally relevant. So I mean, you can have things like just a petri dish with a sperm and an egg in it together has a capacity to eventually turn into something that has subjective experiences. Now you might say, oh, but that's not, well, it's internal to the petri dish for one thing. It's not sort of like this physically continuous, internally functioning unit, but I really think that's highly irrelevant to whether that sort of entity could be harmed by death, or it's like cool enough that we have to care about its interests or something like that. I mean, I think the real question, you shouldn't be doing these lines of how important someone's interests are. It's just, hey, if they have morally considerable interests, what are their interests in these various things? I think there's a way, again, there's a way of understanding this, what Jojo's doing, which is like that. Again, it's all going to come down to whether they are, the same individuals, and whether they're going to give rise to these individuals is not the question. It doesn't really matter. Like sperm egg pairs are going to give rise. The question is whether they are or whether they persist as. And mere pointing out the fact of giving rise to just doesn't speak to that.
All right, we are going to take two more questions, and they will both be for Dr. Nye, because we have exhausted the Jojo questions. This is great. We have 4 more minutes left. We'll go until 8:10, so this will be perfect. We'll do 2 minutes, and if Jojo, if you want to reply, that's fine too as well. We'll go just slightly over. The first one is kind of a cool question. For the Vulcan fetus as example, do Vulcan fetuses have inherent value if that is the last Vulcan fetus of the species in existence? And also, would killing it cause the species to go extinct, or would you think that it is something kind of different from that and it wouldn't count as going extinct to kill the fetus?
Oh, okay, so cool. Yeah, great, very interesting question. So I think that, so if the Vulcan fetus is last Vulcan, well, I mean, I think it's fine, it's biologically Vulcan, so it's still the last living Vulcan. I guess the Vulcans won't be extinct until that one that one dies. Now, again, I think that the reasons to that's going to change things and make the Vulcan fetus different from sort of like Vulcan fetuses when Vulcans are plentiful, or us or human fetuses when humans are plentiful. It's really aesthetic and scientific, right? It's these instrumental things like maybe we could learn a lot from Vulcans, or maybe Vulcans are really cool and the world would be like a cooler place if Vulcans continue to exist. Those are, but I think that those are really weak reasons in comparison to these powerful reasons to preserve other, to not deprive individuals of an entire life full of enormous goods, which I think not only we typical human adults, but indeed humans with severe intellectual disabilities are capable of having. So, for example, if if the only way to preserve the Vulcan species, just make sure that there were more little Vulcans in continuing into the future, and there wasn't a clear sort of way that's going to save many other lives. And the only way you could do that was by like torturing and killing many other Vulcans who maybe sort of aren't gonna contribute enough to like sort of the Vulcan stock. I think that would clearly not be justifiable. Why? Well, because these reasons not to deprive individuals of enormous benefits are just way stronger than these aesthetic reasons to keep like kind of cool, interesting looking sorts of beings in existence in the future. So.
I like Dr. Nye, we've mentioned that a few times already, and I really appreciate this dialogue. But remember, he just said earlier on that we should be able to destroy fetuses at early 20 weeks or so for trivial reasons. So what if my reason was I don't like Vulcans? Would I have a right at that point to destroy the last fetus, or the last Vulcan fetus? Yeah, I guess so, because in his logic, I'm perfectly fine to do that. You see, that's the difference, though, between what I'm arguing and what he's saying. He even said that, if we have sperm and egg, that could potentially be us. Yeah, I guess so, but that's not my argument. We know sperm and egg are parts of a human being. They're not a human being. They're not an organism. They're something created by us. In fact, sexual reproduction requires those two things to fuse to create a new organism. And in this case, a new organism has already been created, a Vulcan organism. And does that Vulcan organism have a right to life, even if I don't like them? The only way to be able to say that is to say, well, no, we can't just destroy fetuses or zygotes for trivial reasons. There's something valuable in them because of what they are, not because of what they can do.
Final question for tonight, and this one takes it in a little bit of a different direction and sees what some of the ramifications of perhaps the reasoning are. On your reasoning, someone uses the example of a relative that they have who was obviously very intelligent, lectured at this university, but now has a degenerative disease, she is progressing towards the point where she has less and less mental functioning. On your rationale, is there a certain point at which she becomes less human, or at which she becomes something that could be terminated? So this would also open up questions of, do you agree with perhaps medically assisted suicide if it was at that sort of level, or maybe something of that sort?
That's a wonderful question. I guess first of all, this is different because you're thinking about, when you say medically assisted suicide, one issue a lot is whether there are just like individuals in full possession of the faculties who autonomously don't want to go on living, and it's not just proxy autonomy for my future all demented self. And I do think there's some different issues in there, but yeah, that they are related. So basically, this is again, I think, where my sort of approach to mental continuity is very importantly different from that of someone like Jeff McMahon, or certainly Michael Tooley, where I think that as long as they have a center of consciousness, the center of consciousness, by the way, to pick up on something else, it persists through bouts of unconsciousness. Right? So I mean, you can be the same center of consciousness persisting and giving rise to consciousness, even though it is unconscious for certain periods of time. But yeah, so the important thing would be, you don't need high-flying, fancy mental states. You don't need to be thinking about, philosophy. As long as you're there experiencing, as long as we have the sort of the center, the individual who's there experiencing the world, and with that, the way I've argued, is sort of a center of consciousness. So you need the neural machinery, roughly the neural machinery needed to support consciousness. You're going to have an individual there who will be harmed by death in terms of it cutting her off from any future goods. Now, I think that if you get to the point where the individual has completely lost the capacity for consciousness and basically experienced upper brain death, then yeah, I think it would be fine at that point to terminate life support. But and the thing is, there's a lot of uncertainty that goes around these issues of whether an individual really has completely lost the capacity for consciousness. And there's been a lot of cases of individuals with this is different from Alzheimer's, but individuals with locked-in syndrome who are very much still there experiencing the world, who have been diagnosed as sort of as not having any subjective experience. So I think we have to be very careful. I think there's an extreme deal of risk involved. And again, that's why I said morning after pill is fine. But when you start getting up into 10, 15, you start getting up into 10, 15 weeks, you're getting some risks of an individual being there and our neuroscientific consensus having missed something. And so I do think it's a bit risky, and so that's why I would, sort of shy away from saying it's okay for relatively trivial reasons. But yeah, certainly at the end, as long as you've got the capacity for subjective experience, and I think we need to be extremely careful about declaring that the individual no longer has the capacity for subjective experience, because the risks are, again, asymmetric, right? If you're wrong about that, and they could have had, several more years of goods, that's an enormous cost. Compared to just having to provide them with a bit more resources. We should approach these in very careful ways.
I like what he said there in terms of risk as well. You don't risk shooting into the bushes unless you know for sure it's not a human being or not a person. So you
ought not shoot them.
If it's a bear, even if you believe in the value of the bear, right? I'm not arguing tonight whether bears are equal to human beings. I'm just talking about human beings today. But in terms of that, then, if we have that basic principle that we don't take someone's life away, just even if there's a risk that that's a person in there, a human being in there, then if there's a risk that we're actually aborting people with brains or consciences, I think we should err on the side of safety and not want to make it legal. At the end of the day, too, what we're actually talking about is two different worldviews, aren't we? We're talking about how we value things. Do we value things based on what they can do, what their function is, or do we value things based on what we are? See, the idea of human rights, what I refer to, always refers to what we are. Humans have human rights. And as soon as you take that away and say, oh, your functions make you valuable, we're no longer talking about human rights, are we? We're talking about functional rights. And that's always led us to dangerous precedents in the past. When we talk about valuing the unborn, we're talking about valuing human beings, human organisms, by the way, who don't disappear. They're just us at different stages of development, as I said, as I've argued, that it makes perfect sense to argue that human rights should belong to human beings, including those not born yet.
Thank you very much to our speakers. Just a few last announcements. Thank you so much for coming tonight. If you want to